All right, welcome everyone. Great. Things look good on this end. Melissa and Leona, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, Leona, can I share screen quickly and then I'll give it back to you? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
I didn't want to take it away if you were practicing.
Sorry.
No problem. Get my... Okay, can everybody see the slides? Great, excellent. Welcome to day 2 of the 5th annual Skirball Family Autism Conference. We hope you enjoyed last night's fantastic presentation, and we're looking forward to today's expert presenters. We would again like to thank the Skirball Family Foundation and the New York State Regional Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders for supporting this conference. We would also like to thank the Strong Center for Developmental Disabilities and Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics for their support as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leona Oaks. Leona is a licensed psychologist in the Division of Transitional Care Medicine within the Department of Pediatrics and in the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Rochester. She has a number of fabulous hats within the university. Dr. Oaks does research with individuals with autism spectrum disorder across the lifespan and is studying how to best assess individuals' strengths and needs and how to use assessment to inform and evaluate interventions. She works at the Complex Care Center, where she sees patients with pediatric onset illnesses and mental health conditions. She has a special interest in assessment and treatment of individuals with dual diagnosis of developmental disability and psychiatric disorders. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oaks. Welcome. And
Melissa.
You're welcome. Oh, I did forget again. This is the second time I've done this. I'm sorry. The housekeeping slides for everybody before we get started. I'm going out of order here. Just to let everybody know, we do have live Spanish interpretation. If you go to the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen, you can access Spanish interpretation. There is also English closed captioning at the bottom of your screen that you can access as well. The ASL interpreters are spotlighted, but you can also pin them if you need to access the ASL interpreters that are on as well. Materials for these sessions can be found on our Skirball website. Most of the resources and information can be found under speakers and sessions. So if you're looking for information, some things will not be loaded until after the conference. It usually takes us about a week to get the videos up. So those things will be on our website, but some of them will not be on till next week. Attendees video and audio is automatically turned off, but you can use chat for housekeeping, and please use the Q&A if you have questions for the presenters. For Dr. Oaks today, we'll be doing questions at the end of her session, so please continue to put those in the Q&A. We apologize if we don't get to everybody's questions, but we look forward to having you guys participate as well. At the end of the conference, you guys will receive an email for an evaluation, and you can get a certificate of attendance once the evaluation has been filled out. And now I will put it back to Leona.
Thank you very much. I'm going to multitask by pulling up my slides while talking, but I think I did that successfully. Thank you all for being here. One little housekeeping warning for myself. My 3-year-old is homesick, so if we are interrupted, that might happen. I certainly hope it won't, but I thank you for your patience if it does happen. I think many of us are in that place where we're working from home with little ones. So when they're sick, it can take some extra juggling. But today I will be talking about supporting and affirming gender identity and sexuality development in folks with autism spectrum disorder, focusing specifically on adolescents and young adults. So just a little outline of what to expect today. First, I'll be introducing a framework for discussion. It's called the Gender-Bred Person, and it's a really lovely way to start thinking about these concepts, to start talking to people about them, whether it's your child or your client and things like that. So it's something we're going to refer to a lot in our talk today. Then we'll go over some of the most important and common terms, because as we'll talk about, language for all of these different identities and for exploring those identities is incredibly important. We'll go over what we know about research, which is what we know from research, which is actually quite little. So we'll be talking about where we also hope it grows. Then we'll talk specifically about how we support that healthy identity development. And lastly, we'll be talking about local resources. So thank you to those that sent questions ahead of time. I've tried to weave anticipated questions into this talk, but as Melissa said, I've created this talk so that we will have time at the end to ask questions and discuss. All right, so first, a quick conflict of interest disclosure. I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. And then I think it's important to also do an allyship disclosure. So I am a cisgender, heterosexual, neurotypical woman talking about communities that I do my very best to support, but of which I am not a member. So I will make mistakes. And it's really important as an ally that I am open to learning from my mistakes. And so that means that if I make a mistake and you have the emotional space to reach out and correct me, I will be very open to that, but also know that if it's a mistake, that I am constantly learning and attempting to grow better in my allyship, and that I don't depend on others to do that work, but I'm always trying to do that work. And so I welcome feedback, but by no means expect it. And in reference to that, I'm also I would like to poll the group to see what our group is made up of as well. And so Melissa, if you could release the first poll question, I would love to know a little bit about what your connection to the autism spectrum is, whether you are someone on the spectrum yourself, if you're someone who supports folks on the spectrum as a family member or professional, if you're here primarily as a student, and of course, it's always okay to abstain or to click that prefer not to say. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to complete that. And we just get these responses in aggregate. I don't get to see kind of who said what, and that's okay. Just looking at kind of who we have as a group.
Okay, it looks like most everybody is answered.
Thank you.
I will share the results here. Can you see those?
Thank you so much. So as we talk about these results, Melissa, if you want to release the next poll, which is asking about how folks define their gender. Again, because we want to make sure if we're primarily a group of allies that we're being really sensitive about how we talk about a group that we're not members of, but that we're working with. So that poll demonstrated that most of us here are professionals, but there was also a really great mix of some self-advocates, some family advocates, and folks that are learning as well. So thank you all for being here. And once again, you'll see that kind of the most common gender identities are listed, but it's also okay to put other. It's okay to say that you prefer not to share.
Okay, I think the results are in again.
Thank you.
I'll share those.
All right, so not surprisingly, especially amongst a group that is also heavily represented by professionals and parents, we are primarily female. So welcome to the men and non-binary folks in this group. Thank you so much for being here. And then Melissa, if you want to release our last poll that looks at our sexuality options. Again, just displaying the most common ones because I didn't expect thousands of people to be here, though that would have been great fun. And whatever you're open to sharing on that as well.
All right, I think our results are in.
Awesome.
So I'll share those.
All right, and so we have a majority heterosexual group, though we also have some great representation from folks that self-describe as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer. Thank you so much. And for anyone that kind of saw those polls pop up and thought like, I don't even know what some of these mean, that's okay. We're going to go over that. So thank you all for your openness to sharing. All right, so there we go. So first I would like to go over the gender-bred person. This is something I use a lot when I am working with family members that are exploring, as well as my clients that are trying to figure out who and what they are. As Melissa said, I'm a clinical psychologist at the Complex Care Center. And so it's because I work with young adults across many developmental disabilities. This is a common question as they start to figure themselves out. And so, when we think about who we are as a person, what our gender is, what our sexuality is, it's not just one thing, right? So we're a number of different things and a number of different ways we present ourselves. And so identity is how a person experiences their gender sort of internally. And that may or may not align with their physical attributes based on the sex parts they were born with and what they were assigned at birth. So their identity is what they truly feel like their gender identity is. And then of course we have, and I'm going to kind of jump to the other side of the display here. Then we have expression, which is how they present their gender, which is affected by everything from clothes to voice tone to grooming habits, demeanor, what name they ask people to call them. And of course, that is heavily influenced by what culture expects of those things, right? So what our gender expression is defined by what we choose it to be, but what we choose it to be is reflective of what our culture believes that gender expression is or should be. So those are also very intertwined. And then of course we have attraction, and that's what people we are drawn to. Attraction can be sexual in the fact that we want to engage in sexual acts, or it can be romantic, where we just want emotional intimacy. Many people, for them, sexual draw and romantic draw are the same, but for others, it can be different. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then, as I said, then there's the sex traits, the physical traits you were born with, as well as the secondary sex characteristics. Things like breasts versus facial hair, chest hair, that kind of thing. And all of these things can be thought of as on a spectrum. And you'll see that what I typically do with patients, and this is again, a free resource, and I'll give links to everything at the end of this. And all of the slides will be available in PDF form with clickable links as well. So people can explore this more. So we think about gender identity as how much womanness you may ascribe to and how much manness. Those are not one thing where woman's on one end and man's on the other, because you can be not man and not woman, or you can be a little more woman or a little less man. It really is fluid between them. Similarly with gender expression, You may express your gender as hyperfeminine, even if your gender identity is man or very masculine. It might be more neutral regardless, right? And so that's where you fall on each of these arrows is not necessarily informed by where you fell on another arrow. So you could be someone that describes themselves as a woman that is hyper feminine, that has very female anatomical sex parts and attributes, but you're sexually attracted to maybe a little bit men, but mostly women or something like that. But maybe you're romantically attracted to both because you enjoy the emotional intimacy of both same-sex and opposite-sex people. And so that's where each of those arrows is independent, and that's really important to recognize, and something that often isn't sort of understood just intrinsically from the beginning, especially depending on someone's background and culture. And so you'll see there's lots of room to figure out where folks lay, and things like gender identity might be more firm, whereas gender expression might be something that changes day to day. You know, maybe when you're going out with your friends and you're feeling super accepted and super comfortable, your gender expression might be very different than when you're at work and you want to be a little more restrained if you're in a workplace where you feel like your gender expression might be criticized. And so these are things that are also fluid and can change in different environments and in different places as you grow up and kind of find your community and find your people. Now, some illustrations, for example, the gender unicorn, which you can also find online, has a third arrow for all of these options of other, because some folks really feel like just even male, female, masculine versus feminine, women versus men is not enough, that they really need an other categories. That's there as well. I continue to use the gender-bred person because I really like how this explains the different terms and everything. But for some folks, we will add an other arrow underneath it to help them continue to really investigate themselves and explore what they find most resonates with them. And that's really the end goal here, is to help the person find what resonates with them. And I love this visual because it gives them permission to really feel it out in different ways and to think of themselves as not categorical. Now, important terms to know, use, and share, as I like to say. So first, there is cisgender. So that describes someone whose gender identity corresponds to their sex assigned at birth. So I described myself as a cisgender woman because my gender identity corresponds with being assigned female at birth. And those are the terms right below it. So AFAB or AMAB are really common abbreviations of these expressions. So there's assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth. And that refers specifically to when the doctor or the midwife holds up that baby and announces what they are, that's what they're assigned at birth. As we know, we think of that as an extreme binary, but it's not truly a binary. We know there are folks that are intersex that have genitalia that may not be differentiated very clearly at birth, or that may change as they're, because we know like some people don't respond to hormones the same way. So when puberty hits, we might see differences in that. And so that's why we specifically talk about assigned female at birth rather than just referencing genitalia in general. But of course, the most important message here is that genitalia is probably amongst the least important aspects of someone's overall gender identity and sexuality. It's the part that they have sort of, that it can be sort of the least important in how they're defining themselves. Then we have the umbrella term for gender diverse, and that just describes all folks who have different gender identities than the typical cisgender heteronormative identities. And then transgender is the umbrella term for anyone who's sex assigned at birth and gender identity do not correspond in the accepted way. It doesn't necessarily mean that their identity is male rather than female or female rather than male. It can be anyone whose gender identity simply doesn't correspond. Sorry, one. Thank you for your patience. Then we have folks that describe themselves as non-binary. This is used primarily by people who do not identify with the binary of male and female. They might identify more as androgynous or just as neither male nor female. And so that is a really important descriptor to know about and to be open to. And then we have gender fluid, and that is an identity that's really a dynamic mix of male and female, where that dynamic might change day to day, different situations, but that they define themselves, again, not necessarily as not male, not female, but often a dynamic combination of both. And that combination may shift over time. All right. Then we have our sexuality terms. And so heterosexual or straight is when folks primarily experience attraction to members of the opposite gender or a different gender than themselves. Gay and lesbian. So gay typically describes someone whose attraction is solely to members of the same gender. Sorry. So sorry about that. All right, so thank you all for your patience. My apologies. Someone who describes themselves as bisexual is a person who experiences attraction to people of their own gender and another gender. There's also pansexual, and those folks typically describe themselves as attraction to all people regardless of gender. And then there is asexual. Those folks experience little to no attraction to others and or may lack interest in sexual relationships in general. Many people that describe themselves as asexual may still have romantic feelings for others, or there are those that describe themselves as aromantic as well. So lesbian is a term used primarily to describe women, and women that are primarily attracted to other women. And then the LGBTQ term is an umbrella term to describe individuals who don't identify as straight and or cisgender. I see the feedback, thank you, that I'm talking a little too quickly. I will slow down, my apologies. And do know again that the PDF of all these slides will be available after the talk. Within LGBTQ, so obviously there's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and the Q is for queer. Many people might think of queer as a slur, and it is still used, unfortunately, as a slur, but many folks in the LGBTQ plus community have re-owned that term queer, and it's something that many folks use specifically in identifying their sexuality, and may use it also to show that they're more of an advocate and really speaking out and re-owning that term and taking it back. As with everything, the use of all of these terms is something that evolves and changes over time. So something I've noticed is that, like in my generation, for folks in their 30s, queer is a term that's still used a lot, whereas it seems like the younger generation is using LGBTQ plus much more as the umbrella term and not focusing so much on queer. Overall, all of these terms that we're discussing are used as adjectives to describe a person. So they're a gay person, a bisexual person, with the exception of lesbian. Lesbian's really the only noun, and using these terms as nouns can be quite offensive. And so that's something that's important to remember, is that these are adjectives in describing someone's identity, not terms for who they are. Okay. So talking a little bit about our current research findings and what we know. Although actually, sorry, I just want to double check. There we go. Okay. So recent surveys have estimated that between 6 to 23% of gender diverse people are autistic. And I use the term autistic as well because I work with young adults, and we know from our self-advocate community that overall there's a preference for identity first language. And so throughout this talk, I'm primarily going to use the term autistic. But that, again, similar to other gender and sexuality terms, is something that can vary person to person. So when I'm working with a client, I'll often ask them, that'll often be one of my first questions when I'm working with them, is how do you describe yourself? Do you describe yourself as an autistic person, as a person with autism, as a person on the spectrum? And what's most important is that you use the language the person uses to describe themselves. So in this 2018 study, 6.5% of autistic adolescents identified as trans, and 11.4% of autistic adults identified as trans. And that's compared to the 3 to 5% of people that identify as trans in the typical population. So we are seeing much higher rates, both when you look at autistic groups and look at the trans rate, and when you look at transgender groups and look at the rate of autism in that group. In addition, higher scores on measures of autism traits. This measure was the social responsiveness scale revised, which looks specifically at behaviors and skills that are related to autism spectrum disorder. We see higher rates of traits are more likely to be correlated with more gender diversity. Continuing on what we know from our research, about 30% of autistic people in a different 2018 study identified as heterosexual. As you can see, that is much lower than the rate of 70%, which is what neurotypical peers, how many neurotypical peers describe themselves as heterosexual. In a 2017 study, 4.7% of men and 14.9% of women on the spectrum reported sexual attraction to neither men nor women. And that's compared to only 1.1% and 1.6% of neurotypical peers. So as you can see, women, autistic women specifically, are much more likely to report not feeling attraction to men or women. That can mean that they would self-describe as asexual or aromantic. It might also mean that they are not attracted to men or women. They might be attracted to folks that are non-binary or more androgynous. They might also not be attracted necessarily to people. There is a small percentage of folks on the spectrum that are attracted more to inanimate objects. And then in our 2021 survey, which is the largest of its kind, the first reporting of these findings just came out this spring, and there's likely to be more papers on these findings as well, so it's something to keep an eye on. They found that autistic adults were significantly less likely to report sexual activity at all, as well as heterosexual activity. That adults were also more likely to report asexuality or other sexuality. As I said, that might refer to objectum sexuality, which is the attraction to inanimate objects. It might also be that their sexuality wasn't well defined by any of the questions, by any of the options on the questionnaires. Autistic males are significantly more likely to report being bisexual than typically developing peers. And autistic females were significantly more likely to report being lesbian than typically developing peers. So now that we know sort of the rough numbers of the occurrence of diversity within this population, why is it so much more common in folks with autism? And right now the answer is we don't know. We don't know why gender and sexual diversity exists in the first place. You know, we don't know why it occurs in some neurotypical people and not others. We know that it's always existed. You know, throughout cultures and history, we have people that describe their attraction and their gender in different ways. In some cultures, that was something to be celebrated. In some cultures, that was something to be hidden, but it's always been there. And so now, as we embrace more terms in our society, as people feel more able to safely come out and be who they are, we see a lot of these things emerge, but that doesn't mean they weren't there before. And similarly, in the autistic community, we're going to talk a bit about how folks start to talk about their gender identity and how their culture shapes that. But some people think that autistic people may feel less pressure and influence from social norms, so they may represent their internal selves more authentically. And that doesn't just mean that other people are going through life closeted. It might just mean that because folks with autism don't feel the pressure from the very young age, that they don't sort of internalize all of those gender norms throughout their age. So it's easier to, or not easier, but more common for them not to ascribe to one gender identity or another because of that. And again, these are all just theories. They're ideas that are put out there. There isn't any research behind them really concluding anything yet. Some folks have seen that autistic folks in surveys are more likely to conclude a more open sexuality based on one encounter or experience. And so that's something where, again, I think, especially in American culture, there's sort of this understanding that folks might experiment when they're young, but that doesn't necessarily define their whole gender identity. Whereas someone with autism might say, like, I was only attracted to the same gender once, but I was attracted to them, so I'm bisexual, and that's how I'm identifying. And so that's something that was seen in those surveys, was that someone didn't need a lot of experiences for them to subscribe to a certain sexuality. Now, I don't know how that would compare to typically developing peers, because we don't necessarily have numbers for how typically developing folks, sort of how long it takes them in terms of experience before they start to identify one way or another. And the last one, so prenatal testosterone exposure has been looked at both in the development of same-sex attraction and in autistic development, but these findings are really mixed. It's one of those theories that like makes sense on the surface. Oh yes, if someone gets a wash of testosterone, it just makes sense that they would be attracted to females, even if they're female, and maybe also feel like their gender identity doesn't match if they were assigned female at birth. But it doesn't make sense or sort of relate to why we also see higher rates of transgender in folks that were assigned male at birth. That doesn't really align there. And so it's a theory that while there might be some prenatal research looking at testosterone exposure, it doesn't explain a significant amount of our population. So most importantly, how do we support healthy identity development? And the biggest way we support it is by creating a culture, whether you're a parent and it's in your home, whether it's a professional and it's in your office, it's creating an environment where we don't assume heterosexuality and cisgender of everyone that walks in the door. We need to start talking about gender and sexual diversity openly when people are young. With a lot of young kids, like as you've seen my daughter come in, that starts with everything from, when we're doing potty training and we're talking about body parts, I say like, yes, like I describe you as a girl because you have a vulva, and most people with vulvas are girls. But if you ever feel like you're not a girl, it's okay to tell mommy and we can talk about it and figure it out. And so it can start as early as that. It starts with introductions in children's books, having books that show different types of families. With, there's a really fabulous book that introduces kind of the idea of transgender by talking about a crayon whose color on the inside doesn't match his color on the outside. So they're beautiful children's books to start introducing these concepts really young. And then as we get older and we start talking about not just gender, but also sexuality, then it's really important to start that education early. So embrace inclusive language. My daughter, again, she has the set of mommy, daddy, baby, but we talk about, when she's older, if she decides to start a family with a partner she loves very much, rather than assuming she's going to want to have kids and assuming that she's going to marry a man, right? We're going to talk about partners that love us very much rather than a husband. So that's a nice way to think about how we use our language in everyday terms, and then use and teach those common terms. My daughter knows that Aunt Carly and Aunt Tamara, they're married to each other, and that's called being lesbians. And so she has the nice example of a healthy relationship in her life, which is a nice bonus. But we also do our best to teach those terms as we go through life. And I feel like it also takes away sort of the scariness of using the term when you grow up with it. I'm really harping on the idea of terms because folks with autism, and throughout many of the research studies that I've read, talk specifically about how difficult it was for them to explore and figure out their own feelings and their own identity because they didn't have the words and terms and sort of images for it in their mind. And so it's really important for them to have access to those expressive tools. And then most importantly, we have to fight against disability shadowing. So especially for folks that are less verbal and whose IQ doesn't fall in the average range, there's often sort of an assumed asexuality. So like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about sex ed for Susie because, you know, she's never going to get married and have a boyfriend. And that's really unacceptable. We can't just assume that because someone has a developmental disability, they don't have the natural, normal human urges that everyone else has. And so sex ed is important for people of all levels and ability. And most importantly, we have to understand that having a developmental disability does not mean lacking sexuality or that sexuality isn't important. Of course, we're going to find ways to make sure that if they are vulnerable, they can explore their sexuality safely and have safe, appropriate relationships. We're going to make sure things are safe, but that doesn't mean we take away all access and all sexuality. So some specific supports around gender identity. So for professionals especially, and we're well represented in this crowd, but for professionals that work in gender clinics and with the LGBTQ+ community, it's extremely important for them to get familiar with autism. You know, as we saw, almost a third of their patients might be on the spectrum. And this ensures equity of access for folks on the spectrum. And in surveys looking at specifically trans folks that are autistic, almost all of them reported delays in gender affirming treatments because they felt like the professionals that they reached out to and wanted to work with really had a lot of doubts around what it meant to have autism and have a different gender identity. And the most important thing to remember is a person with autism is still a person. So just like anyone else might have different ways to feel about their their gender identity and their sexuality, so too does a person with autism. And similarly, professionals like me that work primarily with autistic adolescents and adults must get comfortable talking about gender identity and sexuality. It's something that if I don't talk about explicitly with clients from the very start, almost always comes up. And it's something that can be really important for me to specifically ask about, to give them permission to start talking about it. And as I said, for some of my adults, I might have been the first person to ever ask them about this, the first person to encourage them to think about it. And so, you know, a lot of the adults I've worked with have kind of felt like, well, something was always off and they just assumed it was their autism and that was that. And it was just going to lead to them being different than anyone else. But when we start diving into their gender identity and their sexuality and the fact that other people might feel this way too, then there is a resonance with them that there are others like them, both on and off the spectrum, but that they're not just alone in their feeling and alone in their experiences. And that's crucial. And then finally, autistic folks in the process of transitioning will need more frank conversation about social cues and gender expression, depending on their desired gender presentation and what or if they want people to assume their gender. So if they are a trans man or a trans woman and they want people to look at them and assume the gender they've transitioned to or are transitioning to, they might need much more specific coaching around the fact that when we're assuming a new gender identity, it's not just about the clothes we wear, it's not just about our haircut, it can also be about our tone and inflection. And because many people with autism have different tones and inflection than others, they might need a lot more coaching around that. Now, of course, if they don't have a concern for how other people's view their gender identity, that they want to live what their gender identity is, and they don't care how other people experience it, then that coaching might not be necessary, but it is something that if they want others to look at them and assume the gender that they feel they are, we might need to do a lot more explicit work with them on how to think about that, just because they're less likely to pick up on those social cues of what is feminine behavior in this society versus masculine behavior in that society. And that can be especially crucial for folks that are autistic and trans, and also from a minority culture in the US, because there's ways that, how we present as male and female differs, not just as Americans, but it differs amongst Latinas versus the Black community versus other communities. And so that can also be something that they need to think about more closely and needs to be broken down. And as I was getting to, there are unique challenges of this intersectionality. So someone who is autistic, who is also somewhere on the LGBTQ community, doesn't just have the impact of being autistic and trans and gay. They have the experience of being uniquely those four things at the same time, plus any other piece of their identity. If they're also Latina, if they're also Muslim, if they're also Black, all of that comes in, and that's what intersectionality is all about. It's not just, oh, you have the experience of 1 + 1 + 1. You have the unique experience of being the combination of those things. And so just as we're still developing our understanding of what autism looks like in women and girls compared to our really robust understanding of what it looks like in men and boys, we need to expand our understanding of how it presents in gender diverse individuals as well, because that is going to be different. And similarly, we need to think about how that shifts in culture, right? So I know when I'm doing an evaluation for autism in an American family, that looks very different compared to someone who's just moved over from another culture. I need to do a deep dive into what are their cultures' social norms, so I can see whether or not they picked up on the social norms, not just of the culture that they're in right now, but maybe in the culture they've come from. When we're thinking about gender identity, we're thinking about that as a cultural thing as well, because there's so much intersectionality there. Now, one of the things I've also experienced is I've had folks come in that are trans and say, well, in my trans group, I have a lot of friends that are autistic, and we noticed we have a lot of things in common. So I wanted to come and get an autism evaluation. And it's always great to get those questions asked, but it is really important, especially on the part of professionals, to help people understand that things in common, like interests, maybe experiences of isolation, difficulty making friends with peers, difficulty learning, nonverbals can look very similar between trans folks that are not autistic and autistic trans folks. And so it's really important to pull apart that the actual diagnosable traits of autism to make sure that we're not just saying like, oh, there's a few red flags. Yes, you must also be autistic, but saying like, actually, so even though both trans folks and autistic folks are likely to have difficulty with peer relationships, that looks differently. That looks different across them, but there will be some overlap, and things like that. So it is, there's sort of a lot of deep pulls apart of what it looks like, as well as when some of these traits and difficulties first start emerging, that I found as a professional to be very helpful. So we know gender is sort of less important when we're very little, it becomes much more important in puberty. And so I'll start kind of picking apart like, all right, when did it become hard to have friends? What was the difficulty with making friends? When did nonverbals become difficult? What was the difficulty about nonverbals to really be able to pull apart? Was it when your nonverbals stopped aligning with gender, or have your nonverbals always been difficult? That kind of thing. And then again, with our folks that are both autistic and somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, but actually this applies to folks in heterosexual relationships as well, sensory experiences and sensitivities have a significant impact on the sexual and relationship experiences of autistic adults. And this can be both in a positive way and a negative way. And so it's very common for folks on the spectrum to say sexual activity is, in terms of their sensory experience, completely overwhelming and aversive, even though they want that activity, like physically, they want sexual activity, and just romantically, they want to have that intimate connection with their partner. And then we have folks that are the opposite, where sexual activity tends to be a really satisfying way to meet a lot of sensory needs. But then, as the young people say today, they catch feelings and they need to figure out, what happens when emotions come into play. and what that means for them. And that can mean differences for what it means to have casual relationships as well as more serious relationships. And so overall, what we know, again, self-reported by autistic adults, is that communication with their partners is key. They might need to kind of regulate their sensory experiences ahead of time before they're expecting intimacy. They might need to do something to dull their senses before intimacy. But again, that should always be something that comes first from the autistic person, and then that they work with their partner to figure out what's going to fit best for their relationship. And we do all this because acceptance and affirmation literally saves lives, right? There is a higher rate of suicide in the LGBTQ population that experiences homophobia. Okay, if folks are welcomed and embraced, then it's so protective, and it's incredibly important to protect folks, because this is a very vulnerable place to be. There is still terrible violence against both people with disabilities and people of LGBTQ plus status. I mean, a young trans autistic man was shot, just a couple months ago. And it's one of those things that people find can be so isolating and so stigmatizing, that it's incredibly important to help them find acceptance and find affirmation in their community and in their families if possible. And so denial of any aspect of their intersectional identity puts them at significant risk for mental health issues, including suicide. So it's really important for them to feel safe and to feel loved and accepted, just as it is for everyone, right? And so many have difficulty fitting into typical LGBTQ plus spaces, because members have a stereotyped understanding of autism and might think of it as something that really means more significant developmental delays, or might mean things like significant difficulties in communication. And we know we have a broad spectrum. And most importantly, as I like to remind people, it's important to accept people regardless of whether they use words to communicate or not, and embracing folks of all abilities. And so what I found in my work with young people today is that younger spaces, in younger LGBTQ plus spaces, do tend to be a little bit more welcoming because of the neurodiversity movement, which is awesome. But some older spaces, some more traditional spaces may be quite difficult. And then similarly, many individuals on the spectrum were not believed by family members and professionals. Many of them reported that they sort of only started using gender identity terms once they used them. And then family members were like, well, this is the first time you've talked about this. Maybe it's your new intensive interest. Maybe it's just your new thing. Like we're gonna give this a lot of time. And finding that incredibly invalidating, because when the person looks back at their history, they can often describe many gender nonconforming things that they did throughout their lifespan, but just never had the words to say it. So a lot of times they're met with resistance because they've never talked about this before and they've never described it. And they sort of say like, yeah, well, I didn't have the words for it. And I have the words now. So please believe my words now. And so it's really important to, when someone comes to you and starts talking to you about possible differences in their gender identity and their sexuality, that you really meet them where they're at and ask them about their story and about how they experience things, rather than just to kind of assume that you know them. And then, as I was saying, special care really needs to be taken to reduce feelings of isolation. So, isolation from not being able to share this with close family members and friends, and why it's so important to embrace them in a welcoming, warm environment, as well as to help them find their people. So related to that, what are some local resources? So first, I have some resources specifically about learning about gender identity and sexuality and teaching if you're in a professional setting. So Sam Killerman runs It's Pronounced Metrosexual.com. They are the creator of the Gender-Bred Person, as well as defining LGBTQ+, which is the dictionary that I pulled almost all of our terms from. They have a tremendous amount of resources on their website. They're all really visual and appealing. And they're also all pay what you can. So the materials are either free or pay what you can. You describe your own donation, which is really awesome. Then there's scarletteen.com. It calls itself Sex Ed for the Real World. Again, it's made very dynamic to be appealing to adolescents and young adults. It has a lot of, again, it has the cutting edge, cool lingo from that people will be using, and a lot of images there as well to help with our more visual learners. From the disability side point, so especially if you have folks whose disability might really have a big piece of their identity, there is sex ed for self-advocates. That's also available for free online. The Queer Ability Tumbler group is a group specifically run by people that self-describe as both LGBTQ and disabled. And so they're a disability rights advocacy organization. They do go in and out of how active they are on that Tumblr page, but that page itself has a huge amount of discussion and resources. So even if they're not actively posting very much in the moment that you click on there, there's a huge amount of resources in there. Wrongplanet.net is one of my favorite things to refer autistic teens and adults to. It's a web community designed for neurodiverse individuals and the people who support them. And then for providers that really want to think about what questions do I need to ask? How can I ask them? How can I walk people through this? There's a beautiful provider toolkit made by the Autistic Advocacy Group that helps people think about how to ask their patients and clients about their sexuality and gender. Some of our local resources. And so unfortunately, there is not, and I got this question specifically, of course, and I'm glad you asked it, and I looked really hard, but there unfortunately is not a specific group in our area that currently works with that overlap of LGBTQ and autistic. So I've listed some LGBTQ supports and others that I think would still be helpful. So the Out Alliance is a very large group in Rochester that does a number of different events and has, again, lots of resources. Trillium Health has a number of support groups for LGBTQ folks. For those that don't know, Trillium Health is a health agency specifically focused on those with diverse gender and sexual identities. And so their support groups are facilitated by a professional. So that can be a support group that feels a little bit more welcoming to someone who has that intersectional identity, because you know you'll have a professional there to support you as well. And they have a number of support groups for young people as well. The Rochester LGBTQ+ Together is a very active Facebook community. They're active on Facebook, and they do events in the community in like pre-COVID times, do things outside now and things like that. For folks that are working with trans folks, whether or not they're on the spectrum, the Golisano Children's Hospital, of course, has our Gender Health Services Clinic that helps folks that are trans figure out their health needs and what gender affirming therapies, if any, they want. And then I think one of our most promising groups is Art Connect at Spotted Rabbit Studio. So the Art Connect group is an adult group specifically for adults that are LGBTQ, but Spotted Rabbit Studio also takes in patients, like I have lots of autistic patients there and patients with other developmental disabilities. So I know their providers are very well versed in folks on the spectrum. And so although that group is specifically targeting LGBTQ adults, it's something that I think would be a very safe space for LGBTQ autistic adults. And that's Art Connect at the Spotted Rabbit Studio. And then for those interested, I do have our research citations for all of the research studies I referenced. And again, all of these slides are going to be available after my talk in a PDF format. So now I would love to start looking at your questions and answering any questions. Oh, Out Alliance has shut down. Kelly, I didn't know that. That's very disappointing. Thank you for telling me. Well, that's a shame. I will take that reference out. All right, I'm going to open up the Q&A.
Sure. Leona, what amazing information you have shared with us this morning. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
We are hearing great feedback in the chat, and there are a few questions.
Yeah.
Let's see, and a few of these you've touched on, specifically any groups or resources in our community for teens and young adults who identify as LGBTQ+ and are also on the autism spectrum. So yes. As Leona mentioned, we can make all of these links available. But But anything else you wanted to share about that, Leona?
Yeah, so as I said, unfortunately, there's no specific groups with the overlap, but community is what we make it, right? A community is made up of their membership. And so I like to tell people, you don't know if there's any people with autism there until you show up. And also, feel free to drop my name. I am more than happy to do trainings and outreach to LGBTQ groups that want more autism education so that they can embrace autistic people more in their groups. And so that's something where, you name drop and tell them that I will come, thanks to the Rochester Regional Center, we're always happy to do outreach to groups to help them be more inclusive in who they work with and how they work with them. And so more than happy to work with LGBTQ groups if they're open to it. And so that's where I remind people, well, there's not going to be anyone with autism if we all just kind of don't go to anything. And so part of inclusion might be pushing in, pulling that chair up to the table, but happy to be a voice at that table as well that helps support that inclusion.
Thank you, Leona. So you did elaborate too of how, you gave us some ideas of how educators, providers, and families can better collaborate to promote a more healthy, comprehensive sex education experience for folks. Do you have any specific tips for our parents or caregivers on the call for talking to their child about sexuality?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's where I said, early exposure to all different families can be really important. There are books like Heather Has Two Mommies and A Family is Made with Love, where they really emphasize that families come in all different shapes and colors, that they come in all different sort of constellations. That was the word I was looking for. Thank you. And so that can be really important from a young age. And then as they get older, it's important to kind of talk about, what feelings might be like. So, I feel like because we're in a very heteronormative society, right? Like the Disney princess always winds up with the Disney prince. But it can be good to talk about like, oh, she fell in love with the Disney prince. Some women fall in love with men, but some women fall in love with other women. Or it doesn't matter whether they're a man or a woman. They just like who they like, and that's okay too. And start those discussions that way. As I said, when you try to talk to people about their future, don't assume heteronormative relationships. Don't say, well, when you get a wife or when you get a husband, but when you find a partner that loves you as much as you deserve and treats you the way you deserve, because that's more important than whether they're male or female, right? It's that the partner loves them and cares for them and that they're going to do the same back, right? We need reciprocal relationships. So it starts as early as that. And then just as with puberty, you start to talk to typically developing kids about the feelings that might be emerging and how peers may start talking to them about other peers and who they think is cute and who they think is not. You're going to want to talk to kids with developmental disabilities and autism about that too, right? So we want to warn, especially our girls before they get their first menstrual cycle, that's coming. That's never a good surprise. And so that's also around the time when I start to talk about, sometimes we like someone and they're a friend, but sometimes we like someone and it's a little bit extra. It kind of tickles us a little differently. And that might happen with boys, it might happen with girls, it might happen with just about anyone that you really feel connected to, right? And that's the important thing too, is we're not going to feel attracted to everyone, right? Even whether, regardless of who we're attracted to, if we're attracted to men, we're not attracted to all men. If we're attracted to women, we're not attracted to all women. But we might be attracted to a group. And it's more about kind of feeling out what's okay and what's not. Talking about appropriate behaviors. We talk about like areas that are covered by our swimsuit. It's not okay for other people to touch us there. And that goes with whether they're same sex or opposite sex, right? Swimsuit areas are private areas no matter what. But as we get older, we might get to a point where maybe we want to maybe we want people to touch us there and maybe we want to touch other people there. What does that mean? That's a different kind of interest. That's more than just a friend. That's something we call a sexual interest or a relationship interest. And so that's how I'll start kind of introducing that idea of sexual attraction as opposed to just like friend attraction. And that's sort of a nice kind of way to introduce it. And then just examples and talks, stream as many LGBTQ movies as you screen movies with a traditional male-female romance. If there's not a lot of diversity in your family or in your neighborhood right now, look for communities that have that. A lot of folks, unfortunately experience stigma about LGBTQ and religion, but Rochester is blessed with an incredible number of accepting churches and religious organizations that do embrace LGBTQ. So that can also be another source to find as well.
Terrific, thank you. One last question for you. I know we're running out of time. For our providers and professionals on the call, any advice if they are working with a family who might be hesitant to talk about this? Any tips for our providers on how to really foster that relationship and conversation around sex?
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of times I find it helpful to kind of have a talk with both the adolescent or the young adult and then ask their permission and say, like, can I talk to your parents? Because it is so much scarier for them to talk about these things with their parents than obviously it is for me to talk to them about it, and then vice versa. And so, I feel like parents overwhelmingly, when there is sort of, when their child, whether it's an adolescent child or an adult child, has fear around them, it's less about that my parents are going to throw me out of the house and hate me, and more just like, I don't know what my parents are going to do. Right. And so that's where talking openly throughout their childhood kind of lets them know what they're going to do. Like one of my most visceral memories of my sister coming out was my sister was like, she's like, it's easy to come out to you, but like, I hate that I have to come out. Why is it assumed that I'm straight? So I have to tell everyone I'm not straight. And, and that really struck me as like, you're right. We shouldn't just assume that. So that coming out is such a big deal because everyone assumed you were something else. And now you have to tell them you're not. Right. So creating openness is incredibly important. And then especially when I'm working with parents, I bring it down to what are you scared of? And 99.9% of parents are just scared of their kids being hurt, and are so scared of what this alternative gender identity or diverse sexuality might mean. I often hear things like, it's already hard for them to have friends and fit in because they're autistic. They can't have this too. It's going to be too hard. And I remind them how much harder it is to live with the burden that you can't be your true self with the people that you love the most and with the people that love you the most. We can protect our children and our young people. And fortunately, our world, I would like to say, is progressing towards a more open, accepting world. We hear so much more about advocacy. We hear so much more about young children being accepted from the very start and people not having to fight and wait until adulthood. And so I do think overall our world is getting safer. It's still by no means as safe as it should be and as stigma-free as it should be. And I don't mean to in any way minimize how scary it can be, but it's when they have your protection because they can also be honest with you, that is tremendously safer than if they have to go it alone.
I love that. Leona, thank you so much for this fantastic session. So much wonderful information. We'll make sure to post a copy of the PowerPoint with all of those wonderful links so that those are available to everybody, as well as a recording of today's talk too. With that, I would like to thank all of our attendees. Leona, a wonderful thank you to you, as well as our interpreters and captioning service today. I would like to remind everybody, if you're interested in meeting with one of our family navigators, to check out the sign up on our webpage, as well as our next session today will be kicking off at 11 o'clock, where we'll be continuing the conversation around supports following a new diagnosis. So I welcome everybody to check that out as well. So with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful Friday afternoon, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.